Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today was day 27 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings. They were coming from Truro today, from a hotel there, and featured testimony from Staff Sgt Al Carroll, who was the district commander for Colchester County during the events of the mass casualty. And he testified for 4.5 hours today, and that's relevant because Staff Sgt Carroll, along with Staff Sergeants O'Brien and Rahill, and actually 3 others that we don't know who they were, had requested through the National Police Federation and the Department of Justice accommodations for their testimony. Staff Sgt Carroll had requested that he only be questioned by video and only be questioned by the commission lawyers. That wasn't entirely granted. There was some cross-examination today from the lawyers that remained. Some were not present due to a boycott, which I'll come back to as well. But Staff Sgt Carroll was able to be cross-examined. He had also requested, or the commission had granted his request for as many breaks as he wished. Now, they don't talk about the exact nature of his trauma or any treatment or anything he's undergoing in providing their decision on accommodations for medical privacy reasons. But it was noteworthy. I noticed this at lunchtime that we'd gone 3.5 hours with just a regular morning 15-minute break. And then in the afternoon, it was just over another hour of testimony from Staff Sgt Carroll. And at no time did he ask for a break. And it certainly didn't seem obvious from watching his testimony that he was in any distress, was experiencing any discomfort, or certainly no trauma in giving his answers. So this sort of harkens back to the earlier requests from the National Police Federation for none of the frontline officers who had actually directly interacted with scenes of violence and witnessed some terrible things over the course of those 13 hours. The request was made earlier on in the proceedings that they wouldn't have to testify. That was rejected, and then we saw some of them testify and, cover some difficult ground, but without significant difficulties from my observations and the observations of others. And the same thing happened today with Staff Sgt Carroll. He was able to testify, he was able to give answers, recollect things, I think as well as he would have under any other circumstances. So it seemed like the request wasn't needed. And it was certainly clear from watching him testify that he probably didn't need those accommodation requests. So I think it really undermines the credibility further of the National Police Federation. I think it undermines the credibility of the commission for having granted the accommodations. This was one of the early lessons I learned as an articling clerk. I clerked with, it was Cox Hansen at the time, Cox Palmer now, and I was going to a discovery with one of the partners, Sandra Arab Clark, and there was they were doing insurance side work on an injury case. So the victim, the injured person, was describing a back injury, a very serious back injury that they had suffered. And we get to the end of the day, it was 5 o'clock after a long day of questioning, and Sandra mentioned to me, she's like, they didn't ask for any breaks. They seemed fine in the seat. They weren't uncomfortable, all those things. So these things get noticed. So from that time on, when I was doing plaintiff side work, I would always tell my clients, listen, if you have a sore back, if you have a sore neck, if you're experiencing pain, don't try to tough it out to try to impress somebody. If you're feeling discomfort and you need to get up and walk around for a little bit, say so. Ask for a break. So that was something I noticed, that Staff Sgt Carroll didn't ask for any breaks, didn't seem exhausted or anything. Actually, I thought his affect was very flat. He was very low energy. Also, another thing was that he was asked whether he had read any of his statements, any of the reports, had gone through any of the police dispatch, radio communications transcripts, and no, he hadn't. He hadn't looked at anything since the time. There was a few people he was asked about whether he'd spoke to. He hasn't spoken to them. But the question was never asked, well, is that because you can't, because of your trauma? The question certainly could have been asked, and we wouldn't have had to get into any detailed medical information in order for Staff Sergeant Carroll to answer that question, but it wasn't asked. So was he just not curious about it? He seemed very incurious as he was answering the questions today and recounting what took place. Lots of things he couldn't remember and such. So that was interesting. You know, we have this boycott and these protests today in Truro, where the hearings were being held, where the proceedings, were being held. And it was a nice warm day here in Nova Scotia, so not a bad day to be outside. Good for them. Completely legitimate, and even more legitimate after watching Staff Sergeant Carroll today in his testimony. So we'll see. Don't know if any of the lawyers or federal government people are watching these videos, so we'll see if all of a sudden witnesses start asking for more breaks. They may be catching on that they should, just for image sake, if nothing else. So the other thing I was thinking about yesterday from Staff Sergeant Breyer's testimony was, you know, he broke down a couple of times when he was thinking about Heidi Stevenson and the issue of issuing a public warning, and then the other issue of the push bar, which he didn't notice, and there was, you know, a fire hose of information he was trying to... Anyway, that was all. He didn't notice it, but it still, you know, may or may not have been unreasonable for him to not notice it, but he certainly felt guilty about it and expressed that. And I think that exercise of expressing that guilt and talking about his feelings was probably good for him. I know in the Desmond inquiry we saw some witnesses that, you know, experienced trauma first or second hand, and to get up on the stand and talk about it seemed to be bring some sort of relief or catharsis or something. And I think the commissioners have a real misguided sense of trauma and of just human nature. Why not let people speak about these things? And of course, people are compelled to testify all the time about difficult subjects and difficult things that took place within their own lives. So why should these officers be any different? Particularly because none of them were witnesses to any direct violence, or direct witnesses to any violence, or even violent scenes. So lots of questions about that, and I think we'll hear more about that over the next few days. Certainly lots of media reports about the family's protests, and like I say, I think they're all very reasonable in their stances. This is, you know, supposed to be an inquiry where difficult questions get asked, not a review where we just sort of take things at face value and read the documents. So, like I said, Staff Sergeant Carroll was about to retire. He was only a month away, and that became relevant. He was asked about the mapping that they were using. We saw before with other witnesses how rudimentary, with Staff Sergeant West, how rudimentary some of these things were. Yes, you have marker and pen and paper, it all works. But they also have pictometry, which would have shown this Blueberry Road access potential. Now, they couldn't access it. Staff Sergeant McCallum, Staff Sergeant Carroll, together in the Bible Hill Center, couldn't access pictometry. They weren't able to do so, and so they were left with inferior maps with which to work. So that was a problem. Pretty rudimentary maps, no indication of the Blueberry Road. Another thing that came up, I think, is the sort of hierarchical structure and how that can be an issue. And I've talked about this before, but you know, we hear the question of the public warning, and you know, there was a discussion of Staff Sergeant Carroll talking to Staff Sergeant Halliday, who would then pass it on the line and on the line. Well, it's a really inefficient way to think of things, you know, and to structure information and try to get that information to flow through. And of course, we know that the warning wasn't issued. Now, in her follow-up questions, Commissioner Fitch asked, well, in a regular critical situation, it would be whoever's in charge that would talk about public issuing of public warnings. And wouldn't it have made sense that Staff Sergeant West would be doing that here? And why, Staff Sergeant Carroll, wouldn't you have gone directly there? Well, it seemed like there were all of these filters and layers where you just couldn't break through and get the right information to the right person. And in fact, there was information from lower levels, the constables, that wasn't getting even as far up as Staff Sergeant Carroll, for example. He didn't know until 3:30 in the morning about Andrew McDonald's statement of, hey, it's my neighbor Gabe, he's in a fully marked vehicle, he's wearing a police uniform, all those things. That information wasn't conveyed until, hours after it may have been useful. So those are all questions. The other thing is, coming back to the discussion with Staff Sergeant Halliday about the public warning, which of course is a key point. Staff Sergeant Halliday in his testimony said that, that he disputed that the characterization of that discussion. It wasn't, in Staff Sergeant Halliday's testimony, this brainstorming session with him and Staff Sergeant Carroll and others that, talked about it, it wasn't that at all. So what are we left with? This sort of dispute just sort of lingering. If we had more effective cross-examination, the lawyers would dig into that a little more and get some clarity on who actually said what and what were the various players in that discussion thinking at the time. Now we don't have that. The other thing, so Staff Sergeant Carroll was asked, what thoughts or recommendations, regrets, anything like that he says, because he was the one that was talking to Constables Brown and Melanson about the Onslow Belmont Fire Hall, but he didn't know it was at the fire hall where the shooting took place. He just, everybody, it was sort of all hands on deck, keep going, go after the killer. We'll worry about that later. Staff Sergeant Carroll says he wished he had known it was the fire hall, and if he had, he would have gone to the fire hall himself and explained or talked to people that were there and at least let them know what had taken place and tried to deal with that situation a little better. So that was interesting. And the pictometry, I think he would have preferred to have better maps, although didn't seem too interested in new technology or anything of that nature. Communications channels, he wished that was better done, but didn't have any particular suggestions as to how that might be better done. So that's where we're left with today. One witness, Staff Sergeant Carroll, who received accommodations, didn't seem to have required any accommodations, so that's generating some upset feelings and some protest activity. It'd be interesting now. So next week, Monday the 30th and Tuesday the 31st, it's not quite clear what's going to happen. The other two staff sergeants, O'Brien and Rahill, have received the accommodation of being able to record their interviews. I'm not even going to call it testimony because it's, I'm sure they'll be sworn in, but they're just being interviewed by a commission lawyer. There's no cross-examination. Questions that the participants wish to have asked are going to have to be sent in to the commission lawyers, and then they'll decide, I guess, whether to ask them. So we'll see how that goes. And it's not clear from the commission material exactly when those are going to be posted or played or how exactly that's going to work. So it's an unusual situation to be facing, that's for sure, and completely unnecessary given the circumstances as far as I can see. So we'll see how that all unfolds early next week. We'll be watching to see over the weekend if there's any further communications from the families as to what their intentions might be. The main family group has announced a at least 4-day boycott. I suspect if nothing comes from the commissioners, that boycott may be extended. It may only be in place for witnesses for whom accommodations are being made. So that could be sort of a, intermittent boycott, if I could put it that way. Some days they're there, some days they're not. Or they'll be looking to put pressure on the politicians, the provincial and federal leaders to make some changes to the terms of reference for the commission to adjust the trauma-informed nature of the mandate or clarify what that is supposed to mean in terms of actually getting through a fact-finding process. So those are all things I'll be watching over the next few days. We'll see what happens Monday, if anything is done publicly. And until then, thanks again for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share these with a friend, all those good things. And we will see you next time.